I think this is what freedom looks like, Daniel said, sliding the divorce papers across the kitchen table as if they were a gift instead of a goodbye. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word felt like a nail driven into my chest. After 47 years of marriage, that was how it ended. A stack of legal documents between 2 cups of cold coffee and the morning light crawling across our faded kitchen tiles. I didn't speak. I watched his hand as he signed his name, steady and sure, as if he'd rehearsed the motion. No tremor, no hesitation. Just a quiet certainty that this was what he wanted. He looked thinner lately, his shirts tucked a little too neatly, the scent of some new cologne following him like the shadow of a stranger. For weeks I'd pretended not to notice, told myself he was restless, told myself retirement had made him bored, but deep down I'd known. The sound of the pen scratching across the paper was louder than the ticking clock on the wall. I used to love that clock. It had chimed softly during family dinners, birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings when the kids were still home. Now it marked the seconds of my life collapsing in real time. When Daniel finally looked up, he smiled. A small, polite smile that belonged to a man saying goodbye to a neighbor, not to the woman who had carried his dreams for nearly half a century. "You'll be fine, Em," he said. "You always are." Fine. That word landed like a slap. Fine was what you said when you didn't care enough to mean anything at all. I had been fine through 3 layoffs, 2 mortgages, and years of being the glue that held us together. Fine when the kids needed braces and we sold my car to afford them. Fine when his business partner disappeared with their savings. Fine had been my lifelong job description. He stood, pushed in his chair, and began gathering his things. The suitcase he'd packed before I woke up, the leather jacket I bought him for his 60th birthday, his favorite coffee mug. Watching him move through the house felt like watching a stranger walk through the ruins of my own life. He paused at the doorway, glanced toward the living room, and for a moment I thought he might turn back. Instead, he said, "Tara's waiting in the car." The name hit me like cold air. Tara. I'd heard it weeks earlier, slipped casually into conversation when he mentioned the new yoga instructor at the community center. "She's helping me stretch out my back," he'd said. I'd smiled, proud of him for finally taking care of himself. I didn't realize she'd been stretching out more than that. He adjusted his collar, eyes skimming everywhere but my face. "I hope we can stay civil about all this," he added, as if we were negotiating a parking dispute. Civil. Another word that burned. I wanted to ask him how you stay civil after being erased, but the question never left my throat. Instead, I nodded, because that was what he expected. The reliable Emma, calm, understanding, endlessly accommodating. The front door opened. A rush of wind filled the hallway. Sharp, alive. And then the door closed again, leaving the house in a heavy, unnatural silence. I stared at the empty space where he'd stood, the soft dent in the carpet where his suitcase had been. His cologne lingered in the air, sweet and sharp, mixing with the faint scent of the coffee I'd brewed for 2. My hands began to tremble. I pressed them against the table to steady myself. On the counter sat a ceramic bowl of apples, one of those small domestic habits I'd kept since the kids were young, a quiet symbol of home. I picked one up, turned it in my palm, and realized it was bruised on every side. Somehow that felt right. The phone rang an hour later, Megan first, then Ethan, then Kate. Their voices bled together in my mind. Shock, confusion, anger. "Mom, are you okay? What happened? Do you want me to come?" I told them all the same thing. "I'm fine." The word tasted bitter now. By afternoon, the house had changed. Every room felt larger, emptier, oddly unfamiliar. His chair by the window looked wrong without his newspaper draped over the armrest. The coat rack leaned slightly to one side, missing the weight of his jacket. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. I walked through each room slowly, as if the walls might whisper something I'd missed. In our bedroom, the bed was still half made. His side of the closet was bare, except for a forgotten flannel shirt. I pressed it to my face, inhaling the scent of cedar and betrayal. Resentment crept in quietly like a tide. Not rage, not hatred. Just a heavy ache each time I replayed his words. You'll be fine. You always are. As if my life had been one long rehearsal for surviving him. As if every sacrifice I made, every smile, every night worrying about bills or children or his happiness, had condensed into a single shrug of indifference. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the branches of the old maple that shaded the porch. We planted that tree the year we bought this house, back when we still believed in forever. I watched the branches sway and realized something sharp and simple. He'd taken his suitcase, but I was the one left with the weight. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, the house grew colder. I lit a single lamp and sat at the table again, staring at the blank line where I needed to sign my name. My hand hovered for a long moment before I finally picked up the pen. The ink bled slightly on the page, the letters unsteady but legible. Emma Fraser. There it was, my name standing alone. For the first time that day, I exhaled. It wasn't relief exactly, more like exhaustion laced with something unfamiliar. Space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space that had long been crowded by his needs and his noise. Outside, the sky deepened into violet over the Flatirons. Stood at the window, watching the last light slip behind the mountains we once admired together. Somewhere out there, Daniel was beginning his new life with Tara. Yoga mats, smoothies, talk of energy and freedom. And me? I was standing in the ruins of ours, trying to remember how to exist without him. But beneath all the grief, a thought flickered. Quiet, fragile, but persistent. Maybe freedom doesn't begin when someone leaves. Maybe it begins the moment you stop waiting for them to stay. The nights were the hardest. That first week after Daniel left, I couldn't make myself go to bed before midnight. The house felt too quiet, too full of echoes I didn't yet know how to silence. Every sound seemed sharper now. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the way the floorboards sighed when I walked down the hallway. I drifted from room to room as if searching for something I'd misplaced, though I couldn't have said what it was. Maybe peace, maybe myself. In the kitchen, his coffee mug still sat beside the sink. I'd washed it twice, but I couldn't bring myself to put it away. The handle had a small chip, the same one I used to tease him about. "You're a builder who never fixes anything at home," I'd say. He'd laugh, promise he would, and then forget. Looking at that tiny flaw, anger stirred in me, quiet but steady. He had built homes for strangers, but never finished the one we started together. That mug was proof of all the things he left half done, trusting me to complete them. I went into the living room and sat on the old couch facing the fireplace. The streetlight slipped through the blinds in pale gray stripes. I thought about the way he'd spoken to me that morning. Careful, polite, as if politeness could soften cruelty. "You'll be fine, Em." That sentence replayed in my mind, each time cutting deeper. He hadn't meant comfort. He'd meant escape. He wasn't reassuring me. He was excusing himself. Every memory that followed soured. The hours he spent smiling at messages he hid from me. The new clothes arriving in packages labeled just gym stuff. Even the cologne, fresh, citrusy, expensive. He used to wear aftershave that smelled like pine, simple and familiar. The new scent had felt wrong from the beginning, too bold for the man I thought I knew. Now I understood. It wasn't for me. It was for her. When I opened the hall closet that night, his absence stared straight back at me. Empty hangers swayed slightly, tapping against each other in the draft. I could still picture his jackets there, lined up neatly, sleeves just touching. I used to think he kept them that way because he liked things tidy. Now I wondered if it had been about something else. Control. He chose what stayed and what left, who stayed and who didn't. And somehow I had let him choose for both of us. I carried one of his old flannel shirts into the bedroom and laid it across the bed. I didn't cry. Instead, a strange burning calm spread through me. The shirt was soft from years of washing, with a tear on the sleeve from where it once snagged on a nail. I used to mend things like that for him. Small repairs no one noticed but me. He'd thank me in passing, then forget. Our marriage had become just that, a long list of quiet repairs made by one person. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dresser. On top of it was an old photograph of us standing outside the house right after we bought it, smiling like people who believed in forever. I remembered how proud he'd been. "This place has good bones," he'd said. I believed him then. Now I saw how those bones had supported everything except the truth. The air in the room felt dense, heavy with the remnants of a life built and broken. I pulled open the bottom drawer of the dresser and found a forgotten folder tucked beneath old sweaters. Inside were renovation plans Daniel had drawn decades ago, measurements, sketches, notes about the porch we never built. A wave of resentment rose, sharp and unmistakable. He'd spent years talking about someday, about how we'd make the house perfect when we had the time, when we had the money, when life slowed down. But when that time finally came, he gave it to someone else. I spread the plans across the table and smoothed them out. The pencil lines had faded, but his handwriting was still clear. They were a map of promises he'd made and quietly abandoned. I touched the paper, remembering all the times I'd waited for his help, for his attention, for his love to feel steady again. And now I understood what all that waiting had cost me. The resentment wasn't sharp anymore. It settled into something colder, more certain. He hadn't just left me. He had left the version of himself that once belonged here. The man who fixed leaky faucets and danced with me in the kitchen on Sunday mornings had vanished long before Tara ever appeared. I had been living beside his absence for years, pretending not to notice. The house was still. I stood at the window and looked out at the faint glow of the streetlight reflecting on the snow beginning to fall. The flakes drifted softly, almost silently, like a clean slate settling over everything. For the first time since he walked out the door, something shifted inside me. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't the one who had been left behind. He was. The morning I decided to start the renovations, the air smelled like rain and fresh earth. I woke before sunrise, something I hadn't done since the kids were little, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, a pen, and a cup of black coffee that had gone cold before I even touched it. I stared at the walls, at the same faded wallpaper Daniel had once promised to replace. "We'll get to it soon," he used to say, year after year. He never did. I ran my fingers over the worn surface and whispered to myself, "I'll do it." The words were small but certain, and for the first time in months they felt like mine. The divorce money cleared that week, $46,000. It wasn't much after nearly 5 decades of marriage, but it was enough. Enough to fix what he left behind, enough to remind myself that he hadn't broken me. When I called a local contractor, a man named Henry, my voice trembled slightly. "It's an old Victorian," I told him. "She needs love more than miracles." He laughed softly and said, "Don't we all, ma'am?" That afternoon, I stood on the porch as the first truck pulled up. The sound of tools clinking, boots on gravel, old wood groaning under the promise of change, it filled the air like a new heartbeat. As the men worked, I couldn't help thinking of Daniel's hands, how steady they'd been when he signed the divorce papers. I remembered how he once built a porch swing for me when we were newly married. White paint, smooth edges, hung under the eaves. "Your favorite place to grow old," he'd said. I believed him. Now the porch was rotting, the swing long gone. I ran my hand along the railing and felt the softness of the wood where decay had hollowed it out. It was strange how anger could become fuel. Every memory of his carelessness, every brushed-off promise, every moment he left something unfinished, made me work harder. I painted until my arms ached. I sanded the floors until the scent of raw pine filled the air. Each brushstroke, each nail hammered into place, felt like reclaiming a part of myself he'd taken for granted. Halfway through the renovations, I found something tucked behind the old pantry door. One of Daniel's notebooks, dusty and forgotten, filled with sketches of the house and lists of materials he'd meant to buy. On the last page, in his neat handwriting, he'd written, "Tara says we might move to Denver. I don't think Emma will understand." My heart sank. The words weren't cruel, but they were worse. Detached. He'd planned his escape long before I even sensed he was slipping away. I sat down on the pantry floor, the notebook open on my lap, and for the first time in weeks, tears came. Not quiet tears, not soft ones. They came fast and hot, shaking loose everything I'd held inside since the day he walked out. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the window watching rain glisten on the street. Somewhere in Denver, Daniel was probably sleeping in a bed that wasn't ours, beside a woman half my age, surrounded by the newness I had unknowingly paid for. The house, the car, the business I'd helped pull from the wreckage after his failures, pieces of his new life built from sacrifices he never acknowledged. But sitting there, watching the streetlight shimmer on the glass, another thought crept in, unexpected and clarifying. I wasn't fixing this house for him. I was doing it for me. For every time I swallowed my voice. For every time I accepted crumbs and called them enough. For every woman who'd been taught to be grateful simply for being chosen. I was rebuilding my home, but more than that, I was rebuilding my dignity. By late autumn, the renovations were nearly done. The once gray walls were now a soft cream, the wood floors gleamed, and sunlight streamed through brand new stained glass windows that glowed in amber and cobalt. The first time I saw the light spill across the floor, I had to sit down. It looked like warmth made visible. Henry stopped by to check the last of the work, wiping dust from his hands. "She's beautiful now," he said, looking around the room. "You did this, Mrs. Fraser." I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in a long while. "Yes," I said softly, "I did." That weekend, I drove into town to pick up a few things. As I pulled into the hardware store, I saw a familiar truck parked near the entrance. My chest tightened. Daniel was there, loading lumber into the back. He looked older somehow, tired, worn around the edges. When he saw me, he froze for a moment, then gave a faint smile, the polite kind you give someone you almost recognize. He walked over, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "Emma," he said, "you look good." I could hear the hesitation in his voice, the uncertainty. "I heard you've been fixing up the place." "I have," I said evenly. "It's almost done." He nodded, eyes shifting downward. "That old house needed it. I always meant to—" "You didn't," I said gently, "but I did." Silence settled between us, heavy and conclusive. He looked away first. "Tara's been way under the weather," he said. "I've been helping her move her things." It should have satisfied me, hearing that their bright new story had already begun to crack. But it didn't. Instead, I felt calm. I'd already moved on, not to someone new, but to someone I had forgotten for years, myself. On the drive home, the mountains glowed orange in the late afternoon light. The air was cool, sharp, alive. I parked in front of the house and stood for a moment, looking at the porch, the fresh paint, the warm glow of the stained glass. For years, I had waited for Daniel to make this house whole. But in the end, it was never his to finish. It was mine all along. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in early winter. I was sitting in the living room, sunlight spilling across the polished floors, when I saw a familiar car slow to a stop at the end of the driveway. My chest tightened the moment the door opened and Daniel stepped out. He looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a heavy coat, shoulders slumped as if the cold had settled inside him. In the passenger seat, I could see Tara. Her face was pale, turned away, her posture stiff with something that looked a lot like shame. I hadn't seen either of them since that day at the hardware store, and I had hoped I never would. For a moment, I just stood by the window, unsure what to do. Then I opened the door before Daniel even reached it. Cold air rushed in, sharp against my face, grounding me. He hesitated on the porch, his gaze sweeping over the house. The new paint, the repaired trim, the garden beds I'd replanted in the fall. "You've changed everything," he said finally. His voice carried a tremor I almost didn't recognize, something like surprise, maybe even regret. "I had to," I said. "The old house was falling apart." He nodded, his breath forming small clouds in the cold. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "You always had a good eye for things." The words sounded kind, but they landed wrong, heavy with the memory of how many times he'd dismissed my ideas. When I suggested painting the kitchen, he'd said, "No need to waste money on details." When I wanted to plant flowers along the fence, he called it unnecessary. And now here he was, admiring the very things he once refused to do. I forced a polite smile, but inside, something twisted. He cleared his throat. "I was hoping we could talk." I stepped aside just enough for him to enter, though every part of me wanted the door to stay closed. The scent of pine and lemon polish filled the house, mingling with a gentle warmth from the fireplace. Daniel looked around slowly, his eyes lingering on the stained glass windows glowing with afternoon light. "You did all this yourself?" he asked. "With some help," I said, "but the choices, the design, that was all me." He gave a small, nervous laugh. "Well, I guess you didn't need me after all." The sentence hit harder than he probably meant it to. I didn't need him, not anymore. For 47 years, I had needed him for every broken pipe, every setback, every dream he said we'd get to someday. But when he left, I finally learned how life looked without waiting for him to keep a promise. Tara appeared in the doorway then, her expression tense. She didn't look like the confident woman I remembered. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes too thin for the cold. "We won't stay long," she said softly. "Daniel just wanted to stop by." Her voice held none of its former edge. Life, clearly, hadn't turned out the way she imagined. Daniel glanced at her, then back at me. "We've had some trouble," he said. "The business didn't work out, and the house, we had to sell it. Things have been complicated." His voice cracked on that last word. He didn't say more, but he didn't need to. The pride he'd carried for years was dissolving right there on my kitchen floor. He looked around again, almost pleadingly, as if hoping I would offer warmth, comfort, rescue. But I didn't. Not this time. I walked to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of tea, and carried them to the table. The same table where he'd once signed the papers that ended our marriage. My hands didn't tremble. When I handed him a cup, I said, "Drink it before it gets cold." He took it, and when his fingers brushed mine, I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, the memory of a life he'd abandoned for something shinier, younger, easier. We sat in silence, not tense, just final. He spoke about the children, the weather, small things that didn't matter. I could hear everything he wasn't saying. He wanted reassurance. He wanted the version of me who would fix whatever had broken in his new life. But I let the silence stay. I let him feel the space he'd created. When the tea was gone, he stood. "You've done well for yourself, Emma," he said quietly. "Better than I thought you would." I met his eyes. "That's because you never really saw me," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You saw what I could do for you, not who I was." He opened his mouth like he might argue, but nothing came. Instead, he gave a small nod, the kind people give when they finally understand there are no more excuses left. Tara murmured a polite goodbye as they turned to leave. I followed them to the door, not out of habit, but to make sure it closed behind them. As they walked down the steps, Daniel looked back once more, his breath visible in the cold air. For a split second, I saw something like sadness. Maybe even longing, but it didn't matter. It was too late. When their car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence didn't hurt. It felt earned. I looked around at the life I had built, the clean walls, the soft light, the warmth that belonged only to me. For years, I'd feared that if he left, everything would fall apart, but the truth was simple. The moment he walked out, everything finally began to hold. A few weeks passed after Daniel's visit, and snow began to fall heavy over Boulder. Outside my window, the world looked quiet, tucked under a blanket of white. The holidays were approaching, though I hadn't decorated much. Just a small wreath on the door and a candle in the window. I didn't need more than that. The house itself felt alive now, glowing softly with its own kind of warmth. For the first time in years, I woke each morning feeling at peace. One afternoon, while sorting through old mail at the kitchen table, I found an envelope without a return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named Rachel. She'd read about my home renovation in a local magazine. The article had called it "A Story of Renewal." Rachel wrote that she was 64, newly divorced, and terrified to start over. But after reading about me, she'd applied for a small business grant to open the bakery she'd always dreamed of. "You made me believe I can still build something of my own," the letter said. I held those words for a long time, my eyes blurring. I didn't want praise. Not really. What I wanted, what this letter gave me, was a reminder that what I'd done mattered. That surviving quietly was still a kind of light someone else might find their way by. Later that evening, I turned on the small lamp in the living room, and the stained glass sent warm reds and golds drifting across the walls. I thought about how far I'd come, from the morning Daniel told me he wanted freedom to this moment, sitting alone but content. My heart still carried the marks of those years of neglect, but the marks no longer hurt. They'd healed into something stronger. Still, the past has a way of knocking when you least expect it. The next morning, a message came from Ethan, my middle child. "Mom," he wrote, "Dad's been trying to reach you. He said he wants to apologize." I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, the part that had carried decades of silence, wanted to hear what apology sounded like coming from him. I told Ethan I'd think about it. A few days later, Daniel showed up again. I met him at the door before he could ring the bell. He looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer, his eyes tired. "Emma," he said softly, "I just wanted to talk." I didn't step aside this time. I let the cold air remain between us. "There's not much left to say," I told him. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry. For everything. For how I left, for how I treated you." His voice cracked a little, and for a moment I saw the man he used to be, the one who danced with me in the kitchen, who made me laugh when we had nothing but each other. But the memory didn't hurt anymore. It felt distant, like something that belonged to a different lifetime. "I hope you find peace, Daniel," I said, truly. He looked past me into the house, as if searching for a trace of what he'd lost. Then he nodded again, more to himself than to me, and walked away. I closed the door gently, not in anger, but in finality. That night, I sat by the fireplace with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the flames flicker. My phone buzzed with a message from Kate, my youngest. She had seen the same magazine feature Rachel mentioned. "Mom," she wrote, "I didn't realize how strong you are. I'm proud of you." I smiled, tears rising before I could stop them. For years, I'd believed strength meant holding everything together. Now I understood that strength was knowing when to let go. I made myself a cup of tea and stepped onto the porch. The snow had stopped, and the world looked new beneath the moonlight. The mountains stood steady in the distance, silent and unmoving. I breathed in the cold night air, letting it sharpen something inside me. I wasn't angry anymore, not at Daniel, not at the years I'd lost, not at myself for staying so long. The resentment had burned itself out, leaving room for something better, gratitude perhaps, or peace. I looked through the window at my house, the soft light spilling from the windows, the shadows of the furniture I'd chosen myself. Everything in that home, every color, every board, every nail was mine. My phone buzzed again, a message from Rachel this time. She'd sent a photo of the new bakery sign, Second Chances Cafe. I smiled so wide it almost hurt. A gentle wind rose, carrying the scent of pine and something sweet from far away. I thought of all the women like me. Women told they were too old to start over, too small to matter, too late to begin again. I wished I could tell each one what I had finally learned. You don't need to be chosen to be worthy. You don't need someone else's love to start living again. Sometimes the quietest revenge is this: building a life so full, so peaceful, so entirely your own that the people who once broke you can't recognize who you became without them. If you've ever been left behind, if you've ever been told your story was over, believe me, it isn't. It's just beginning.